Hey everyone, welcome to the second After Effects tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to build on what we were doing last week, and I'm going to introduce you guys to a bunch more stuff. I'm going to introduce you to bringing vectors into the file. I'm going to introduce you to bringing more images into the file and creating layers. I'm going to talk about coming into Premiere Pro out of After Effects. And I'm going to talk about doing some basic kind of scaling and movement things. So the first thing I'm going to start with is this clip that we were working on last week, where we've got these two composite images set in relationship to one another. And the first thing I want to do is show you how another benefit of the pre-compositions means that you can manipulate things within a frame. And what I mean by that is if we go into the static images, so we double click into that pre-composition, we have here our just our static images and their sequence from one another. Now, if we open these up, in the left-hand side, you can see the arrows. And what happens if we click these open is we open up a whole bunch of parameters that we can control. So if I zoom out here really quick, I'll just pinch to zoom. Okay. If I zoom out here quick, I'll just show you on this first one how we can change the relative position. So if we click the stopwatch on any one of these parameters, it's going to allow us to adjust that parameter. And what that means is, I'll show you quickly for an example, is we can shift the relative position of an object. So if I first click on the stopwatch, that creates a keyframe wherever my playhead is. So now wherever the position of that image is going to be saved in that keyframe. And if I move to the end of that clip, and I shift it around, you can see that it's created another keyframe. And so if I move through that clip now, you can see the moving image, right? So we have a track across. Obviously, right now I'm just doing an up and down pan, but we could, for example, let's make this image a little bit larger. Let's shift it a little bit out of frame in that way. And so let's do sort of a pulling across the image. Okay, that's going to be really fast probably, but if we jump back to the main body now, if I come to the front of the composition, the full composition, the main composition, and I press spacebar to play, you can see how we have a static image, but now it's moving, right? Okay, so that's one way in which, if we want, we can draw attention to specific elements of a photograph by revealing over time what it goes to, right? So that is the same for each of these things. So if I click on this one and I open up the menu palette and I bring it to the beginning, I click on position, stopwatch, move it to wherever I want it, and then move it to the end and drag it down. And now my first two images are going to be in motion. Okay, so as you might imagine, what you can do with that by staggering these things is you can start to build up, for example, opacities. So I'm just going to press T on that, which is the shortcut for bringing up opacity. You can find that as well in the main transform window. There's shortcuts for all of these things, which as you play in the program more, you will learn, and it'll improve your workflow if you can kind of learn these things. But they're not super important to learn at the beginning. Anyway, so if we click the opacity stopwatch, it's going to create a keyframe here. I want to drag it over to where that overlap begins, make another keyframe. So I want to go in opacity from 100. If I click on this arrow, it's going to take me to the next keyframe. And then if I drop that to 0, what you can see is within that duration now, I have a crossfade, right? So we have these two moving images, and we have a crossfade between. So now, if we want, we can be more gentle within our transitions, okay? So I'm not going to go through finessing each of these elements, but just to introduce you guys to the basic fact that one of the benefits of the keyframe means you can make one of the benefits of the pre-compositions means that you can make a bunch of internal edits and our fundamental bounding box isn't going to change. We've got all this kind of movement and things happening within. It keeps my main composition file structure nice and clean, but if I want to go in and edit any more, I can edit all those parameters. Now, of course, we could also edit these parameters in the main composition. So again, if I open this up, I could change the scale of my main window frame over the course of whatever duration I want to make it. So let's just go ahead and make it the full thing and change that back up to 100. So now we have our initial size, and we can see that my position has jumped out of it. Last time, if you remember, I just sort of indiscriminately changed the position of it. So let's re-change the position back to where it was. Again, it's going to snap to that guideline that we made last time. So let's lock our position at the end where the playhead is. And now if we bring it back to the beginning, I can change that position back up to where it was, roughly. And so now you can see over the course of this time, it's going to enlarge our window. It's going to be moving through. And so basically, we have the same editing feature set that we have in the key in each composition layer. And we can nest pre-compositions as far as we want to, okay? So now let's say that now that we're looking at sight a little bit more, I want to bring something else into the conversation. So initially we have some photographs and we have some video. These things are beginning to tell a story. But as I accumulate more data for that story, I have more things that I can bring into this conversation. Now, one of the things that animates this site that I'm looking at, which is a wetland that exists in North Berwick, is the wind, of course. Now, we're seeing that in the right-hand side, but we're seeing the kind of behavioral patterns of the wind. We're not necessarily seeing the sort of climactic understanding of the wind. So, for example, if I wanted to bring that in to the conversation, I might go to the Met Office. And on the Met Office website, I can find a series of surface pressure charts. And now these are from the Met Office, a series of static images, right? But in After Effects, as we've seen through the previous tutorial, we can create a pre-composition which turns these static images into a moving image, or a GIF, right? So what I've done here is I have ripped, or I've just dragged, I've just, clicked and dragged these images into my Finder. Okay, I renamed them sequentially so that if we just space through them really quickly, we can see how over the course of this day, the wind pressures are moving across and animating the weather patterns. Okay, so now if I drag all of these again into After Effects, again, they come into my library. And if I say file new or new composition, and I want this one to be wind patterns, okay. And if I drag these guys into the pane here, we can see I've got my wind data. That's super. Okay, so now we will make them all say, well, let's just say 1 second. It's probably going to be too long, but that's all right. Okay, and then Command Shift D to create that duplicate track cut. And now we have them all neatly stacked up. So now I'm going to drag them all over one after the other so they can be sequential. I'm going to drag my playhead to the end, change the window, double click and say trim comp to work area. And now this pre-composition is just a staging through of that wind data. So now if I come back into the main body composition and I can take that from the asset panel, wind patterns, and I can drag that up on top here, and we can see what I've got is that animation of the wind patterns, all right? So now that compositionally doesn't look great, right? It looks way off. So there's a couple things that I can do to play with that. One would be, well, the conversation between the static image and the wind isn't really doing much, right? There's no dialogue there because the static image isn't really moving. Where the dialogue exists is through the moving image. So presumably I want this to situate somehow within that. Now, we could, that's fine, right? Okay, we can kind of see how there's something happening here in terms of a dialogue between how something behaves and the systems that control it. I could bring those things into a further dialogue if I wanted by changing the blend mode. Okay, so to bring that window up, if we double click on our top bar here, and we can see columns, and if we click on mode, that's going to bring up our blend mode. Now, blend modes are in Photoshop. Blend modes are, I think Illustrator actually doesn't have them. But for those of you who played with them, they're the exact same here. So if we change that, for example, to an overlay, what we can see is the beginnings, perhaps, of a dialogue between the interface of the wind and the patterns. Now, that might not work so successfully. Let's say what multiply does. Multiply looks a little bit cleaner, but I can't really see the lines so well. So let's see if I take that and go up to my effects panel here and change that to an inverted image of itself. And perhaps now that's clear. Now we're seeing the grass movement through the wind patterns. Now, obviously, if I play with the blend modes here, I'm gonna get a whole range. If it just becomes white, maybe it's too obscure. But you guys can play with this. You can mess around with these parameters and see what works best to tell the story that you're trying to tell, okay? Now, so I've done a bunch of different stuff there, right? I've moved things around, I've added some effects, I've changed size, I've layered things up, and that works for anything you want to do, right? Again, as I said last week, the important thing to remember here is what the intent is. Now, if I want to take, so now up in that main body, you can see I have that invert effect, which I just put on. If I scroll over to the side, I still have my my asset panel, but now that I have an effects put in, if I scroll to the right, you can see where our effects have been applied. Now, if I want to get rid of that effect, I have a couple options. One, I can click on that FX panel, and that will take the invert on or off. So that's non-destructive in the sense if I possibly want to keep it, or I can just delete it with the delete key, okay? So we've got a couple things happening in conversation with one another now. We've got a couple things layered. Well, let's say I want to add something else into this mix, all right? Let's say I want to bring us from the wind data, which is talking about our site at a particular scale, into a conversation with another thing that I have learned about this site, which is the contours of the site. So here what I have is I have a contour map that I've taken from Digimaps. For those of you who have not yet been introduced to Digimaps, Digimaps is a resource that you guys have free access to, where you can download CAD files for anywhere in the UK. It's an amazing resource for site work, right? I hope you guys have talked about it already. If you haven't, here's your opportunity to get into it. So you need to register to be able to do it, but with your student email addresses, you guys have access to it. And it allows you to get buildings, roads, all that kind of information. In this case, I'm only interested in the contours. So I've deleted everything else out, and I've got those contours as an Illustrator file. So if I come into Illustrator, I can do whatever kind of manipulations I want to do in Illustrator. But with that Illustrator file, I can click and drag it into After Effects, into our asset pane. And when it comes in, I want to do it as a composition, okay? So you have the option to do it as footage or composition. I want to do it as composition. Let me say okay. And now what we have is we have the full file itself as a pre-composition, but we also have access to all the individual layers that we have. So let's say, for example, we had a layer that had buildings on it, we had a layer that had roads on it, we had a layer that had hills on it, etc. We could add those things together in time if we wanted. So if I just take those contours and I drag them down into my timeline window, you'll be able to see, when I come over to base, that I have this After Effects composition that I can work with. So now if I want to open up the parameters box again and change the scale, because as we can see, it's not taking up the full thing, but it's not taking up the full window, excuse me. But I also probably want to be able to animate it in some way so that I'm directing you towards what we want to see. So let's say, for example, that I want to lead you along the edge of this hill here towards this area. Now, the reason I want to do that is because the wetland where I've taken these photographs situates itself right here. And the burn that feeds that wetland comes along this edge. So suddenly I'm going to use this map to tell the story of how we navigate across the place towards something. All right. So what that means is I want to probably first start by scaling up. Now you can see what's happening here is that it's scaling from this piece here. What that piece is my anchor point. Okay. I can click that anchor point and I can move the composition around from it. But because it's scaling from the middle of the composition itself, and not from where I'm trying to focus attention, it can be a little bit of a challenge. So if I click on the anchor point, if I drag the control points of the anchor point, I can relocate such that my composition will be anchored around the apex of what is the North-Barak law. Okay, so now when I press when I control the scales, I will be scaling from that central point, okay? So that allows me just to have a little bit more control over what I'm doing. All right, so let's start at the beginning. I'm going to turn off these other layers for the minute just because I kind of can't see what I'm doing so clearly. Okay, so I want to start by moving the position from, let's say, about here, ultimately, let's move to the plate to the end, to down here. So now when I scale across, you can see how we're moving again across from that water source into the area that the water feeds. Maybe I want to add on a little rotation as well because it doesn't feel so naturalistic to move in just like a straight line. So over here I can click on rotation and then jump to the end, and I can put just like a subtle like 5-degree turn on that. Let's see how that looks. Maybe that's a little bit too subtle. So let's jump that up to, say, 10%. Now, the benefit of bringing the vectors into this are multifold. One, vectors don't lose resolution, right? So as we scale them, it's going to remain at the kind of, the highest fidelity of line quality. Right now, it's kind of rendering in a compressed way. But if I click, what I did here, what this panel is doing is it's controlling the degree of resolution in your working window. Normally, you want to have it on a half or a third, say, because it's more taxing on your processor to have it at full. So generally speaking, I have it on half or a third, and that just makes the kind of pre-rendering easier. But you can see when I jump up to full that actually the resolution of the vector is being preserved. But it also means that if I want to do any editing in Illustrator, this file is going to live update. Okay, so let's just come back into here, for example, and just in the interest of showing you guys what I'm talking about, if we make some kind of, something to identify, where I'm going to on site, for example. Save that. Okay, and now it should live update back in After Effects. Yeah, so super, super powerful in terms of its integration, right? Now, let's say actually that what I want to do is I want to draw our attention to the site, but I don't want to give it all away so quickly. Right? I want that dot to change in size, and I want it to come into focus rather than simply always being there. All right? So let's go back to Illustrator. Let's take that dot. Let's delete it out. Save it again. Yes. And now when I come back in, it's going to disappear. Beautiful. Thank you, Illustrator. Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to create a new shape layer. All right, and in that shape layer, I'm going to come up here. I'm going to make an ellipse, and I want my ellipse to be like this, let's say. I'm going to make it just a slightly nicer color. drop it down, mute it a little bit. Whatever. I want it to be in conversation with the lines behind. So I'm going to change the blend mode to, say, an overlay. So now I'm looking through it. And now, because I have this vector created as a layer in Illustrator, what I can do, I'm just going to quickly get rid of it off of my composition, is I can change its position and its size. So if we say P, that'll open up position. If we say S, that'll open up scale. And we could change over the course of its time, say from 0 to 100. And make the position. So I'm going to click that stopwatch because that's where I want it. So it's going to lock it there, come back to the beginning, and I want it to be probably out of frame actually. So if I take that and drag it up here. So now when I press spacebar again, we're going to see that circle kind of coming in and beginning to draw our attention to something. What's it drawing attention to? To the site. All right, cool. So that is, again, just a bunch of stuff that you can work with. I'm kind of firing through things because I just want to open up your guys' minds to the possibilities of what you can do here with this tool. Now, what are we missing here? We're missing the conversation with the filmic. So let's open up. Let's turn those layers back on in terms of visibility. Again, we can see we have that similar kind of problem that we had previously with the weather data in terms of there's not enough of a conversation happening between the images yet, but you can finesse that. Again, let's say I wanted to have that kind of slowly fade in. I can adjust the opacity over time. So T is the shortcut for opacity. If I click the stopwatch, drop it down to 0, bring it over a little bit, and jump it up to 100. So now we have a kind of a quick fade in of those contour lines. Now I want more video in because I want that video to be in conversation with the contours of the land. So if I double click back into here, I can see that in all of these video clips, I have more footage than what I was using previously. So if I just drag that, that's going to determine how much I have. So I'll just drag that all the way to the end. I will drag my playhead to the back. I will adjust the timeline and 2-finger click trim comp to work area. Now my composition is taking up the full clip there. Now if I come back into main body and drag that pre-composition out to the end, I have video which continues over into the world of the vector. Cool. So now this isn't really working yet, from like from a graphic standpoint, in the sense that I'm not really paying attention to composition, which I told you guys is something that you really do need to pay attention to, and of course you need to pay attention to. But I'm just trying to introduce you to the tools. Okay, so but the point here really for me is one, to begin playing with it, and two, for you guys to take ownership of what that story is. So I'm trying to give you the kind of, the keys to the car, as it were, but it's on you guys to kind of drive that car wherever you want it to go. All right, so I've got something that's happening. I'm kind of excited about it. That's great. Now, I want to talk about moving this thing into Premiere Pro, which becomes more of your kind of let's say meta compositional program. You can do everything in After Effects. I do it all the time, and you do not need to use Premiere Pro at all if you don't want to. However, Premiere Pro is better for some things. And the kind of primary thing that it's better at is your overall composition, especially if you're going to be working with lots of other clips. So you can make your pre-compositions in After Effects and then kind of stitch all those compositions together with extra film and sound and all that kind of stuff in Premiere Pro in a really nice way. All right, so let's save this project really quick. And then if we jump over to Premiere Pro, new project, we'll just call it test. And then browse to find where we kind of want it to be. I want it to be on my desktop. I'll say choose. That's great. Okay. And this brings up similar window to After Effects, right? So on the left, bottom left here, we have our asset panel. And if I double click on that, I can navigate to where my After Effects composition is, say import, or I can drag it and drop it. I really just want to bring in the main body for the minute. Click that, and if I drag it over onto my timeline, I've got my first clip, okay? This is something that happens kind of often with After Effects, and to be perfectly honest, I have absolutely no idea why, but you can see how the background has turned black, right? We set it up initially to have a white background, but because we don't have a solid layer of white behind it, sometimes, either when you're exporting or when you're bringing it into Premiere Pro, that will disappear. So the way to fix that is if you just say layer, new, solid layer, and make a white layer or whatever color you want. Okay. Oops. Okay. Okay. Drag that down to the bottom. Save this. Jump back over to Premiere Pro, and now suddenly it fixes it. Yeah, it's weird. I don't know what it's about. But anyway, okay. So now what we have here is we have all of our work from After Effects treated as if it's just a clip of film. Okay. So if I come over into Finder and I come back into some of my other Filmic clips from last week, and I drag these guys over into this panel, it's going to give me all of these clips. I can now take these individually and can drag them in. You can see my sound, basically you have a top panel, which is your video files, where you can have different layers of videos. Your bottom one, where you have sound, you can mute that. Here you can solo that if you have multiple audio tracks, etc. I'll talk about sound a little bit more in a different tutorial, just because that's a whole other kettle of fish. But yeah, so basically though, now you can see how, if you're working with a lot of different clips, this can be really beneficial rather than working exclusively in After Effects, because once you start doing all the edits on image sizes, moving, text getting added, vectors getting added, etc., your files can get really big. And so if you're talking about, let's say, working on a short film of a half an hour, your After Effects file would just get ridiculous very quickly. And so that's the sort of workflow where you'd want to bring in Premiere Pro. So you can trim clips with C for cut. That brings up a little kind of razor blade. Now suddenly I have these things kind of delaminated from one another. I can drag the audio tracks separately or the video tracks separately, etc. So now, because that's stacked on top, it's going to work exactly like a Photoshop layer in terms of jumping on top of it. If I take that and drag that up and bring it over on top of that, we can see how these things can be layered on top of one another. You can, change the kind of, the black and white. You can change all sorts of effects within Premiere Pro as well. I would kind of encourage you to keep editing in After Effects for the moment, only because it just keeps things a little bit cleaner for you, just mentally, in terms of trying to kind of get to terms with one program. But yeah, so that was a wind rush through a lot of different things. But the biggest thing to remember is, as you add in complexity to the story that you tell about your site, it's important to bring people through that journey and to sequentially sequence that journey such that over the course of whatever length your film is, we gain a sophisticated understanding of what this place is. And so gather data, which helps you tell that story, sequence data, which helps you tell that story in a coherent, clear, logical way. You can bring voiceover in, you can bring sound in. Again, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I hope this is useful for you guys. And again, I really look forward to seeing your films. So good luck.